Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle 𝘠𝘰𝘵𝘪𝘐𝑚 et comme Hakim l'a anticipé, je fais ma thèse à l'Université de Palerme. Alors, ma présentation, je l'ai préparée en anglais et du coup, la présentation sera en anglais et j'espère que tout le monde dans la salle n'a pas de souci justement avec la langue anglaise. Du coup, là, je bascule vers l'anglais. My presentation, the title, Third Space as a Literary Metaphor for Permanence Within Migratory Interstices, Postcolonialism, DIY Cultures and Migration Writings. And today we are going to talk about the idea of third space, which in French, as you guys would know, is tiers-lieu, and the related idea of DIY cultures, do-it-yourself culture. And we are going to do all of this from a post-colonial perspective. And while I was preparing this presentation, okay, let's see if it moves. So while I was preparing this presentation, I figured I might spend like 2 or 3 minutes to, to make a couple of clarifications about what postcolonialism is. Because oftentimes when I when I have conversation with people, they would ask me, okay, Sham, what do you do in your research? And when I reply by saying that I do research on post-colonial migrant writings, I often get the reaction, which is the following: that's cool, but what do you mean by post-colonial? And so, as I keep talking with people about post-colonialism, I have come to the realization that a lot of people often have certain misconceptions about post-colonialism. And so let me just start by telling you guys what post-colonialism is not, based on the assumptions people often seem to have. And then I'm going to tell you what post-colonialism is. And this is very important because everything else I'm going to talk about will come from this understanding what post-colonialism is. So when we talk about post-colonialism, the prefix post in the term post-colonialism doesn't mean sequentiality, for instance. So it is not a chronological indication of something that comes after colonialism. So post-colonialism, for instance, is not post-independence. It's not like decolonization. It is not something that comes after the colonialism era. And that's the very first clarification I wanted to make. And it's very important to keep in mind because people often seem to, think about post-colonialism as something which is after colonialism, and in thinking that way, they kind of like assume that we do not have colonialism anymore. And so that's the first clarification. The second one is that when we use the prefix post in post-colonialism, we do not mean polarity in the sense of that which is opposed to something else. So, for instance, post-colonialism is neither anti-colonialism. And for those who may not know what anti-colonialism is simply a political and ideological movement which opposes colonialism and neo-colonialism. And so it's very important to, keep these two distinctions, these two clarifications in mind. And now that we know what post-colonialism is not, let's talk about the idea of post-colonialism in a positive way. So let's give a definition of post-colonialism. The prefix post in post-colonialism insists instead on the idea of beyond. And beyond here, it's very important to keep in mind because in post-colonialism, people often tend to think in terms of binary thinking, in terms of opposition, in terms of, boundaries. So the term beyond means we need to go beyond fixed binaries, for instance. We need to go beyond fixed oppositions. We need to go beyond fixed boundaries, for instance. And the term beyond here, it's, synonymous to the idea of third space or tiers-lieu. And we might now have a first definition of third space, which is an expanded and eccentric site of experience and empowerment. And this sentence here is very important too to keep in mind, because to be honest with you, this is, let's say, the summary of all what I am going to be talking about today. So this sentence here tells you more or less what you need to know. And to be honest with you, I was like, okay, I can stop my presentation here, because with that sentence you have everything about third space. But I imagine that people might say, okay, give us some contextualization around the sentence. And so everything else I'm going to be talking about from now on is going to be a huge contextualization of the phrase an expanded and eccentric site of experience and empowerment. And so the first context we should have in mind when we talk about postcolonialism are the people who kind of like theorize the postcolonialism as an academic field. And you have these three people here. And of course, we can throw in the mix, let's say, some other figures, but these are the main figures that should come to mind when you talk about postcolonialism. So we have, for instance, Edward Said, who published Orientalism, and Orientalism is a seminal, is a foundational work in postcolonial theory. We have Gayatri Spivak, and she is also a very important figure in postcolonialism, and she published like many works, but one of the most important work done by her is Can the Subaltern Speak? That's a very important book in postcolonialism. And of course we have Homi Bhabha, and Homi Bhabha, it's important in this presentation because we are going to be focusing on one of these two books here. One is The Location of Culture, and the other one is Nation and Narration. We will see just in a couple of minutes on what of the two volumes we are going to be focusing on. And so that's the first context we should have in mind when we talk about postcolonialism. The second context to keep in mind when we think about postcolonialism is that postcolonialism tend to work in terms of global dynamics. And by global dynamics, I mean simply everything that happens around us and everywhere around the world. And so, for instance, we should think, when we think about postcolonialism, we should think of the legacy of colonialism in our present day, because everybody here inherited somehow let's say, we inherited something from colonialism which we did not partake in any way, shape, or form. And one other aspect we should keep in mind is the significance of global migrations. As everybody know, nowadays we have large fluxes of migrants coming, like moving around the world, and so it's important to keep this in mind. And so those are the two contexts we should keep in mind. So now let's delve a little bit into the idea of third space into in the postcolonial theory. And so what do we mean by third space when we say third space in postcolonial theory? What do we actually mean? This book here, The Location of Culture, was published in 1994 by Homi Bhabha, the academic we saw in the picture above. And in this book, Homi Bhabha theorized the idea of third space. And here, let me put a caveat, which is that Homi Bhabha is a very complex thinker. And the idea of third space, it's also a very complex idea. And so what I'm going to do here, it's a huge oversimplification of what Bhabha means. And because, he talks in a very complicated way and in a very interesting way, but we are going to simplify for the sake of this presentation. So the first thing Bhabha says about third space is that when two cultures meet one another, neither of the two cultures fully dominates. What happens is instead a fusion, a contamination from one culture to the other. And when this contamination, this fusion happens, something emerges from that fusion, and the thing that emerges is called the third culture, and that's the third space. And so third space in Bhabha's idea is, let's say, the birth something that arises from the encounter of two cultures. And that thing there is a hybrid culture, is a hybrid language, for instance, is a fluid and in-between culture. And this culture, this is important to remember, the culture that emerges from the encounter of two other cultures is an unstable and, it's not a fixed culture. It's unstable, it's expanding. And that is what we call liminality. So third space in post-colonial theory is a liminal space, is a transitional space, which is marked by negotiation rather than fixed identities. And the forms of lives that emerge from let's say the third space do not have any prior existence within the concrete wall of any single culture. And so that's, let's say, what we can say about third space from a post-colonial perspective. Now let's try to apply the concept of third space to the migration phenomenon. So the first thing we can say about that is that migratory interstices is synonymous to third space. And what happens is that immigrants, when they leave their home country, for instance, they inhabit a place which seems to me to be identical to that of third space, which is a space where they have to kind of like, it's a space where you have the gaps, the transition, the liminal zones, which can be geographical, cultural, or existential. And here we are going to focus just on the cultural part. And concerning the culture, we might define third space or migratory interstices as that space where the past has lost its grip and the future has not yet taken form. So as you can see, it's a space, is a liminal space, is a space where transformation occur, and it's an in-between, unstable, unpredictable, and precarious, and always in transition. So that's what we can say about migratory interstices. And in 1999, this book here called La Double Absence was published by Algerian sociologist called 𝘠𝘰𝘵𝘮𝘳𝘰. And 𝘠𝘰𝘵𝘮𝘳𝘰 was actually a collaborator with Pierre Bourdieu, and Pierre Bourdieu is a very famous French sociologist. And in the introduction to this book, Pierre Bourdieu says the following, describing the situation of migrants, so, which is, comme Socrate selon Platon, l'immigré est atopos, sans lieu, déplacé, inclassable. Rapprochement qui n'est pas là seulement pour anoblir pas la vertu de la référence, ni citoyen, ni étranger, ni vraiment du côté du même, ni totalement du côté de l'autre. Il se situe en ce lieu bâtard. That's the definition, as far as I'm concerned, of third space, dont parle aussi Platon, la frontière de l'être et du non-être social. So this is how Pierre Bourdieu defines the idea of third space from a migration perspective. And now let's touch very quickly on the idea of DIY, do-it-yourself culture. And here I should caveat by saying that this is not my field of research, but since the theme of this event here today was on DIY, I decided to read a couple of articles about the subject. And so what I could gather from my reading is that DIY emerged in the early 20th century, and it initially was used to kind of to define, let's say, home improvement and self-made artifacts like clothing, furniture, art and crafts, and musical instruments. And in the 1970s, the idea of DIY will become much more popular, especially thanks to the punk counterculture. And punk, for those who might not have a clear idea, it was an Anglo-American oppositional culture, and it would later become a global counterculture, let's say, and it would be used in production like music production, cinema, fanzine culture, fashion, and so forth and so on. And there is a very interesting academic journal which is, let's say, edited by Andy Bennett from Griffin University, Australia, and Paula Guerra. And these two editors here define DIY in a very interesting way. And I say interesting because we are going to see that immigrants often have to adopt just what we see now. So they define DIY as alternative cultural practices pitched against mainstream, mass-produced, and commodified forms of cultures. This is very important to understand because now, as we said, okay, so maybe the question we should ask ourselves here is how can we apply the idea of third space to migratory interstices and see how immigrants often have to adopt a DIY culture. Again, when immigrants get to a new country, so newly arrived immigrants in a new country often have to inhabit, let's say, a space which seems to be a third space, a migratory interstices. And in those migratory interstices, there is what we can see as a collapse of all human standardized, let's say, practices and behaviors and reference. So when you are in a new country, reference, for instance, to time changes completely. When you are in a new country, references, let's say, to the space itself changes. And when you are in a new country, let's say, a lot of things that you did in your country do not work in the same fashion. And so, for instance, immigrants living, experiencing that expanding environment have to adopt, let's say, a DIY mode, and they do that, for instance, by inventing a somewhat third persona, which is, let's say, a flexible identity allowing immigrants to move back and forth from their culture and their language of origin and the culture and the language of the host country. And this is very important, for instance, in, let's say, mixed couples or mixed children or children from mixed couples. I say this because if you have, let's say, two people, one coming from what it's called high context culture and the other one coming from low context culture, what happens is that they might be communicating but not getting each other because they use different set or different type of, let's say, communication and so forth and so on. And so one other way that immigrants often kind of like have to adopt a full DIY mode is by reinventing their culinary identity. And they do this simply by mixing things from their culture of origin and the culture of the country in which they live. And this is exactly what food expert Fabio Parasecoli, an academic at Stanford University in New York, says. He said, migrants' food cultures are influenced not only by their past but also by their current situation. And as a result, meanings migrants attribute to their own food are never completely defined once and for all, but are endlessly negotiated and transformed in everyday life. Eva, combien de temps? Just to conclude on a couple of, yeah. And so Fabio Parasecoli tell us that immigrants often have to reinvent their food ways too, and he also explains the let's say what he calls the omnivore paradox, which is what people often experience when they get to a new place. On the other hand, the immigrant might be a neophilic immigrant in the sense that they might desire the new, they might want to know or eat the new food that they find in the new environment. Or they might also, let's say, experience what Fabio Parasecoli called neophobia, which is the fear that the new is potentially dangerous for the person. And this is not necessarily something that, let's say, happens completely in one person and the other thing happens in one other person. It might be a mixed in one individual. So one individual can at time experience, let's say, neophobia and neophilia at the same times. And here I give, let's say, examples of literary text where you can find description, narrations of how people often, let's say, behave in a very neophobic way toward the new culture. And here you have the example of the contrary, how someone arrives in a new place and just want to completely forget their culture of origin and their food ways and adopt the food ways of the new cultures. And the last thing we are going to see is an exemplification from a literary text of third space in a broader term. And so this book here was published in 2005 by 𝘰𝘩𝘐𝘳𝘤𝘩𝘦. And 𝘰𝘩𝘩𝘐𝘳𝑤𝑡 is a very, she's an Italian writer, and she was born in Rome to a Somalian family. And she's one of the most important migrant writers in Italy. And she writes about immigrants' internal conflicts and identity crises and so forth and so on. And so she publishes one short story in this collection here called 𝘠𝘰𝘵𝘪𝘳𝘐𝑲𝑡. And in the book, in the story, what 𝘰𝘩𝘩𝘐𝑲𝑡 shows is, it seems to me to be like the explanation, a literary explanation of what third space actually means. So her mom arrives in Rome. Okay, now I'm talking about what happens in the story. The narrator's mom arrives in Rome in, let's say, like in the 1990s, and after 30 years, she's been living there in Rome, but with the idea that she has to go back to Somalia one day. And so for 30 years, the mom has been living with suitcase, with her things in suitcase, having in mind that one day she will be going back to Somalia. And so at a certain point, her daughter wants to buy a house in Rome. And for her, that's a problem, because in her mind, if you buy a house in Rome, you are going to kind of like decide to definitely stay there in Rome. So you are going to anchor yourself to that place. And so in the book, there is the opposition between departure and permanence. And by departure, we mean the idea of the mom who wants to go back to Somalia. And that departure is symbolized by suitcases, because in the family, everyone has their suitcase, which is ready at any time to go back to Somalia. And suitcase for the daughter becomes, a sign of anxiety, lack of identity, lack of stability, and permanent restlessness. And so suitcase becomes a problem, because it symbolizes the idea that they have to go back. And at the same time, the daughter wants a permanent life in Rome. She wants to buy a house. She wants to have a fiancé. But for her, that's a problem, because buying a house would be for her mom, buying a house would be somewhat betraying Somalia. And so they have to inhabit that space which is ambivalent, which is not clear. And so as we can see in that literary text, we have, let's say, an experience of the third space, or the post-colonial idea of beyond, which is, as Baba would say, neither a new horizon nor a leaving behind the past. And this family, in order to find new love in Rome, which is not only kind of like person-to-person love, but love in general, they have to kind of like solve that problem, and they solve it by doing everything by themselves. And so thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah.
Questions? Alors, vous pouvez poser des questions en anglais ou en français. Je peux répondre dans les deux langues de toute façon.
Exactement.
C'est à vous. Est-ce que vous avez des questions pour 𝘠𝘠𝘠𝘦?
I'll ask the question in English for consistency.
Yeah.
Thank you, and I'm very sorry for missing the start.
No problem. Yeah.
I think you might have an inkling about the question I'm going to ask you. So I had the great privilege a couple of years ago of working with you for your final master's dissertation.
Exactly.
On sort of accessibility in the urban space in Palermo.
Yeah.
Where one of the things you talked about was that it's, if we look at frameworks, we often quickly think of sort of sensory, cognitive categories like that.
Yeah.
But you very rightly talked about the question of kind of socioeconomic accessibility
Yeah.
in urban space.
Yeah.
I'm wondering
Yeah.
We say that society should adapt to people's needs.
Hmm.
Are DIY cultures a way around that problem?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Will. And again, I like the way you keep pushing me to think further. So thank you so much.